Guys, you don't even know why, but can we just give John Hodges a big round of applause? He is just, yes. I'm not worthy. Okay. Thank you for being here. I love Colossians and Philemon. We're going to talk about that in a second. But before we do that, I want to talk to you a little bit about how I like to teach, because I think sometimes that's helpful in knowing kind of what to expect and knowing what I kind of want from you, okay? So like I was saying as you were coming in here, sermons and lessons are very different, right? Sermons hopefully are a little bit collaborative, hopefully a little bit you feel drawn in and like you're a part of a conversation. Teaching should be highly collaborative. My opinion is adult learning should be highly collaborative. So I just want to kind of tell you a little bit about my class values, okay? So adult learning is best when it's highly collaborative, okay? Adult learners aren't necessarily learning new content all the time, not nearly as much as younger learners. A lot of times, adult learners are thinking about things that they already know differently. The way that you do that as an adult learner is collaboration. You listen to other people. You hear other opinions. Okay, so for adult, I need to say this first. I don't like it when people say formation, not information, because it makes the two things sound like they're opposites. Information is formative. Good information is formative. Learning, Jesus loves you, not judges you, is formational. What's more formational then is what you do with good information, okay? So we're going to talk about formation. The goal is formation over information, but we are not dealing without information. Information is important and valuable. Okay, so those are my class values. Here's some more. Adult learners are formed most by conversations on the edge of their comfort levels. Okay? So we're going to call that the leading edge. So what I like to do is I like to give a little bit of content, a little bit of information. I like to make you a little uncomfortable. And then I like to make you talk about in your uncomfort, your discomfort, okay? Because you're going to learn most when you're right at the edge of your comfort. I don't actually want to make anyone uncomfortable. I want to bring you a little bit close to your comfort level, because that's when adult learners learn their most. So, therefore, co-learners should strive to create a gentle environment with which to learn, okay? That's going to mean that we're going to be nice to each other. My job is going to be moderator, which is not to be like, hey, stop being me, because we're not going to do that, right? But if adult learners learn best from the leading edge of their comfort level, then what my job is going to do is to make sure that when you speak, the room really hears you, that we really get to the bottom of what you're trying to say, that we're listening for the main point of what you're saying, not for how we want to respond to what you're saying, and that we have, own your own opinions and learn from those whom you disagree. Everyone deserves, this is what I want to say, everyone deserves the most generous interpretation of what they're saying. So the question when I'm listening is, what's the best version of what I hear this person saying? That's going to make the leading edge, which is what forms us, palatable, comfortable, and that's going to make, people be nice to each other. So my job's moderator, my job's making sure we're really hearing what you're saying. It's really clear. I'm going to hopefully be helpful in bringing out the clarity of what you're saying. Your job as listeners, when someone else is speaking, is to give them the most generous interpretation of their words. That's how we're going to learn best, okay? I'm trying to do two things at once. I'm catching up to my own stuff. Oh, yeah. We don't judge motives. Okay? That's going to be one hard and fast rule. The quickest way for this room to become inhospitable so that everyone shuts down and no one talks and no one really learns is for you in your mind to go, well, he's just saying that. She's just saying that because what she really means is that's judging motives against the rules. Against the rule. It's the only rule. Against the rule, don't judge motives. Anytime you hear your words anytime you hear your own mind saying the word just, well, he's just or she's just, that's a mental cue that I am judging someone's motives. No one is ever just saying something. No one is ever not. We are complex people, okay? deserve the most generous interpretation of each other's words, and we're not going to judge motives. Are we good so far on the ground rules? Is this all making sense? Okay, good. I don't want to spend too much time on this. So here's some of my strategies. We're going to do content and context. What did I mean by that? I'm struggling to... Oh, content and context. What I want to start with, what I want to do every class lesson is really get into what the content and the context of what Paul is saying is. We often misunderstand Scripture because we assume it goes without saying. Well, it goes without saying. But we are 21st century readers of first century text. What is in our minds when we say, well, it goes without saying, is different from what is in their minds when they think, well, it goes without saying. And when they write something and in their mind's like, well, I don't need to go all into this. When Paul says, I don't need to explain all this, in his mind, it goes without saying. So it's going to be really, really important that we start with content and context, okay? So that's how we're going to start each class. Then we're going to ask some probing questions based on this new content, based on this new context. We're going to think, and then we're going to pair, and then we're going to share. So you have full permission to move chairs any way you want to do, to turn and talk to each other. What we really, really, really want, the most important part of class, hear me say this, the most important part of class is not going to be me saying smart-sounding things. It's going to be you talking and listening to the people you're sitting next to. Okay? The pair part of think, pair, share is what I really, really, really want to be a rich experience for you because you're an adult learner, and that is what will be most formative. Okay? Therefore, and then after that, what I would love to have happen, what I would really love to have happen, and I know it's asking a lot, but if you would be courageous and own your own opinions and trust the people in the room with you, I would love for you to share either what you have thought about or what you have heard someone share. Just so you're wondering, we are videoing the class, but when the think, pair, share time comes, we're going to stop the video because I don't want you thinking, is someone I know going to go watch a YouTube video and hear me say something, and then, I'm going to get an email later, okay? So, no broadcast, no recording when we are asking you to speak. We promise, and it's not even going to be aired till later, so we'll have the opportunity to edit it out should someone forget to stop recording. So far, so good? Okay, after we do think, pair, share, we're going to respond some. We're going to talk about new implications. This means that we are going to move on sometimes at a snail's pace. I'm okay with that. I really like that. I really hope we finish Philemon and Colossians. Realistically, we're going to get about halfway through Colossians. I'm fine with that. And if we get through the first chapter of Colossians, the first chapter of Colossians is so rich and so formative and so life-changing for me, I think, when you understand the context of it, that it's good enough. Okay, so we will move on slowly, and that's okay. All right, I think low and slow. We're going to go low and slow. Okay, why do we want to talk about Philemon and Colossians? Well, because I like it. That's why. I want to talk about Philemon and Colossians because I like it. Well, why do I like it? I like it because Colossians is one of the least autobiographical books of Paul. That doesn't mean that I don't like Paul and I don't like learning about Paul. I do. But it's the least autobiographical because it is the most clearly Christological. When I say the word Christological, what I mean is the study of Christ, Christology. Paul wants to get clear the truth about Jesus Christ. And what Paul thinks about the truth about the Jesus Christ, it's crazy. It's a reinterpretation of all Scripture. It's claims that, if we truly understand the depths of them, would defy logic. But it's beautiful and it's life-changing. And Philemon traveled with Colossians. So why do Philemon and Colossians go together? Well, because when Paul sent the letter to Colossians, he sent it with the letter to Philemon. Philemon is an individual letter. It's to one person. It was probably read to the entire church, which when we read it, we'll understand might have been a little embarrassing for Philemon. But they traveled together, and so the early church said they go together. But we're not beholden to that. The reason why we're talking about that is because I think Philemon is a key to understanding and unlocking the truth and the depth of Colossians. What Paul says in Philemon, what he believes is true about the world, it's going to help us understand Colossians really, really well. Okay, so what do we want to know? That is the map of the ancient world. I find it very helpful to understand where in the world we're talking about because geography affects things like people's lives. And so if we're going to understand content and context, it's really helpful to know where we're talking about. We're going to zoom in and see that's a little bit closer. Okay, so here we've got the Mediterranean Sea. You can see Jerusalem down there. The red dot on Google Earth there, that's the ancient city of Colossae. And then if you see how it kind of dips down there in modern-day Turkey, where it's kind of pointing at Cyprus, there on the mainland where it's kind of pointing down, that's about where the ancient city of Tarsus is. So Paul is from Tarsus. He makes frequent trips to Jerusalem because it's the center of power for the Jews, and he is writing a letter to Colossae. Paul is kind of halfway between Colossae and Jerusalem. So he knows these people probably. He's presumably been there. He understands the culture of the Jews and the culture of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. Before I zoom in even more, I want to show you one more thing. You can kind of see the boot there of Italy in the very top left corner. We are in the Roman Empire period of the world. Just west of that is the Grecian Peninsula. Okay? So Colossae was a more important city when Greek was the world's dominant empire of the world. It was a very, very important city because, let's zoom in, you can kind of see maybe a little bit, if it was even clear, I can see it really well, that there is a river valley that starts there at Colossae. And so Colossae was, when it was the Greek Empire, a very, very important city for trade because it was really a lot easier to move things on water than it was on land. And so if you could get something to Colossae, you could get it to the Mediterranean Sea. So you can imagine Colossae is a very rich city during the Greek Empire because if you can get it to the Mediterranean Sea, you can get it to Athens, and that's where the money is. Okay? Well, now it's the Roman Empire, and Colossae is not quite as important anymore. And so we can imagine in our minds a city that once vibrant, once dominant, now a little bit in decline. Okay? All right. A little more content. Today's going to have more content and less talking than any other week, but I need us to talk about a dominant issue in the ancient world. And it is this word, paterfamilias. Okay, is there any brave soul that just wants to raise their hand and just yell out, what does that Latin word paterfamilias probably mean? And the graphic up there is going to help. Father family, the father owns the family. I am not being figurative. The paterfamilias is the way that the Greek, Greco-Roman culture exists. I said this in the sermon, but we have got to remember constantly that there is no social system of help in the ancient world. If a woman's husband dies, her options are to beg or to turn to prostitution, unless somebody brings her in, unless a man marries her, or a man brings her in and she becomes a slave maybe in his house. So it's really important when we hear Paul talking about family and Paul talking about culture that what he's talking about is the paterfamilias. It is the legal system of the ancient world. I want to read this definition. In the Roman family law, power that the male head of the family exercised over his children and his more remote descendants in the male line, whatever their age, as well as over those brought into the family by adoption, this power meant originally not only that he had control over the persons of his children, amounting even to the right to inflict capital punishment, but that he alone had any rights in private law. Thus, acquisitions of children became the property of the father. The father might allow a child, as he might allow a slave, certain property to treat it as his own, but in the eye of the law, it continued to belong to the father. Anything that any individual in the family owns does not actually belong to them, it belongs to the father. When we talk about the Sanhedrin or the law code or the Roman law, that only applies to the pater within the paterfamilia. Because inside the paterfamilia, dad is the law. He decides what goes on. Okay? This is going to be really, really important for our understanding of everything going on. The male head of the household, usually the oldest of the male, who was granted pater potestas, which is the definition I just read you. Power potestas is power of the father, Roman law granting the paterfamilia total control. The man over the family has total control over everything he owns, and part of his ownings are the people who live on his property. They are to him legally the same as his cattle and sheep. And that sounds cruel and mean until we remember that if somebody doesn't own you, you don't have a place to live. You don't have a job. Because if I bring someone on, let's say I bring on a child of someone whose father and mother just tragically died, they cost me something now if I'm a paterfamilia. They cost me something. It is generous of me to bring someone in and me now own them, because without that, they have nothing. There is no Roman government that's going to look at the ancient city of Colossae and like, well, these poor orphans, we got to do something. They don't care. They don't care. Rome's only value is, are the cities that we have dominance over sending taxes in? It's all that matters. Okay, so the paterfamilia, we have to understand, is the essence of this culture, okay? I'm going to keep talking about it. There's no social safety net. Women and children belong to their... Okay, so this also includes refugees and people experiencing poverty. In the Roman world, there was a lot of war. Rome is trying to conquer everything. This often created refugee crises that we sometimes even see today. But there is, United Nations. There is no Red Cross. People are in charge of going and just showing up, maybe to a city like Colossae, and hoping somebody will make them their property. It sounds awful. It is awful. It's ruthless. People live on this zero margin line. If something awful happens to you, no one's bailing you out. Okay? The paterfamilia is, like I keep saying, is super, super important and to understand this. This gets us to an even more uncomfortable thing that we need to talk about. We need to talk about slavery. Philemon, the book of Philemon, which we're going to get to in a little bit, is about a slave named Onesimus, and we need to talk about slavery in the ancient world. Rome is the first slave society. Okay, so slavery has always existed. Okay, there's always been war. When a conquering empire takes over a lesser empire, they then take their strongest and they become their slaves. Rome is the first slave society, which means without slavery, Rome can no longer function. Okay? This includes Egypt. This is a huge thing that we also need to remember to understand what's happening in Philemon and Colossians. Rome has so mastered slavery and the owning of people that if slavery were to be somehow done away with, which has never existed in any empire in the history of the world up to this point, they could now no longer function. Historians think that if Egypt, who built pyramids with slaves, did away with their slaves, they could have kept functioning. But Rome is the first slave society. They have so many slaves that they are now dependent on slavery. So what was slavery like in the first century in Rome? Well, this is helpful. I'm going to have to read a lot of this. So we're going to compare Roman slavery to what we might call slavery in the antebellum South or 15th through 20th century Euro or New World slavery. Roman slavery is mostly through war and conquest. Okay, so Rome is trying to take over as much part of the world as they possibly can. When they do so, they take the strongest and most healthy males and females from that society. They now become slaves of Rome. Or the unhealthy, the least strong, they become refugees, who then also become slaves at a lesser city. That is how slavery mostly happens in the Roman world. In the kind of slavery that we think about, often called chattel slavery in the antebellum South and other places, it's mostly through colonial conquest. So, England, Portugal, Spain, going to Africa, stopping in Africa, colonizing Africa before moving on to New World places and taking their slaves with them. I'm not necessarily trying to set up which one's better or worse. I'm trying to distinguish them because there are differences, okay? So, chattel slavery and bonded slavery is the Roman world. What's the difference between chattel and bonded slavery? Chattel slavery sounds like cattle. Chattel slavery means that they are cattle, that the person who you own can be separated from their family because they're just an individual. And so it was legal in ancient Colossae for you to buy a family and then sell them individually. Unbelievably cruel. Unspeakable cruelty. You have to only think of them as chattel to do this. In the Roman world, chattel slavery exists, so does bonded slavery. Bonded slavery, also awful, but you could not separate families. Bonded slavery would sometimes mean like if my family's on really rough times, me and my wife just had another kid, we can't support the kid because we're kind of poor, I can bond my child to someone else and still see them, they can still get an education. There are examples of bonded slaves that never had their freedom but became very, very influential and powerful people and could earn their own income. They just always are owned by someone else. So there's chattel slavery, there's bonded slavery. In the ancient Roman world, there is both. Antebellum South, it's only chattel slavery. There is no bonded slavery. Chattel slavery is the cruelest, most unspeakable, most unkind, most inhumane kind of slavery. And so we have to remember, when we talk about Onesimus and Philemon, we don't know what kind of slave he is. Could be chattel, could be bonded. It is mainly not a segregated society. So you could be a slave who works for someone else and be sent to work on a farm with free people who are also working on the farm. Slaves and non-slaves passed in and out in society. And of course, antebellum South in the Americas is only segregated. Education was possible, like I said. There's examples of very, very famous slaves becoming influential thinkers. In the American South, in fact, it was a law in order to keep slaves in our chattel society. You could not educate them because education is power and we need to keep slaves. Some held positions of power while remaining slaves. There is exactly no upward mobility in the antebellum South. None. It would destroy the system. Manumission is possible, though unlikely. What does that mean? You can buy your way out. It was possible to buy your way out. And in the antebellum South, the only way that system was ever going to end was through emancipation. Full-blown, it is now not legal to own people. I'm trying to create an image here, and that image is this. Often, New Testament teachers will say things like, well, when we're talking about slavery in the Roman world, it's not that. No, it's awful. It's awful. It's unspeakable. Human beings owning other human beings and treating them like chattel, it's awful. And yet there is a difference, because in the 15th through 20th centuries, Euro, New World, it was more awful. It was more awful. The country we are founded on is founded on chattel slavery. It was also the South, a slave society. It could not exist without it. And we need to be clear on some things here. We're talking about slavery. It's awful, but it is different. It is different than what we often have in our minds when we think about antebellum South chattel slavery. Questions, comments, concerns so far? Okay. Not much more, and then we're going to start talking. So, okay, here we go. We're going to start talking. I was right. I want us to ask this question real quick. I want us to do some think, pair, share. And so I want you to think about the question, turn to someone you trust next to you, and talk about it, and then we might get into things a little bit more. How does culture impact gospel? We've been talking about culture. And in the first century culture, we've got to understand paterfamilias. The system is built. Culture is built on this. Every person that lives on dad's property belongs to dad. That's the culture. How does that culture impact the gospel that Paul might be trying to talk? How does that culture impact what we might say and think about Jesus Christ? And then maybe even think, pair, share, what about our culture? How does our culture impact gospel? Okay, this is the moment of truth. This is the moment we're going to decide if whether or not this is... Yes, Dexter, please. Questions are always okay. Thank you. Yeah. How does one who determines who becomes a slave? That's a good question. My simple, oversimplified answer is going to be you become a slave when someone else owns you. There's more than one way that can happen. You can be bonded. You can become a refugee. You can become the conquest of war. And in all of those situations, you now belong to someone else. You don't own yourself. And so why I keep harping on paterfamilias is we've got to think about each literal plot of land as a pyramid. At the top is dad, and he owns everything under it. And so people are belonging to the property on which they live. If they don't own that property, they belong to dad. If someone is not a biological son or daughter, there are other instances where you can be bonded to that land and not technically a slave, but more than likely, you are a slave to that land, to that person who is in charge of that property. Did I answer your question? Okay. That's a great question. I don't think we know. Is he a bonded slave? Is he a chattel slave? I don't think we know. When we get into it, we're going to figure out he probably stole some money or something when he left, and he did not leave with permission of Philemon, and so he's a runaway slave. I don't think we know by language or context, but what I mean by language is sometimes you can tell by the name if they belong. Onesimus is a Greek name. Philemon's a Greek name. And Onesimus might not be his birth name, right? It could have been his slave name. I don't think we know. I could be wrong about that, but I don't think we know. Fascinating. That's a great question. Okay, now you're exposing that there's, yes. Sorry, what he's saying is, could Philemon pass? Okay, so now Dexter's asked a really good question, and I'm realizing there's a hole in my preparation. I'm trying to remember the best theory. So Paul's in prison when he writes this, and Philemon gets to him from Colossae, which means wherever he is, maybe as far away as Rome, he must have either been traveling in secret, highly dangerous and very unlikely. And so, Dexter, that's a great question because it seems like he is passing through, if it's even a small amount of the ancient world, he is not visibly, ethnically so different that he can't pass, or he's very lucky. Because he is traveling through places that all agree on paterfamilias, and if a slave is found, they are immediately dealt with harshly. Yeah. Courts. Yes. Yeah. So that's kind of a similar. So they would probably consider that a form of bondage. So the question was, aren't there kind of slave courts if somebody can't pay their debts? Do they then become? That's going to be a different form of bonded slavery. I owe something to you. I can't pay it. I've then become so bankrupt that now you own everything I have. That person is now bonded to that person, and so they would be treated differently than a chattel slave. That person would presumably not have their family split up and sold. No. Right. Right. We don't know. Yep. And I want to be clear. Most scholars agree manumission, which is what you're talking about, paying your debt and not being bonded, is possible. And we could just imagine like human. What am I looking for? Who we are. Sometimes we're not good people. Manumission was very unlikely. You could always figure out, oh, well, you paid your debt, but the interest rate rose quite a bit the 5th year that you were raising. Now you actually owe me a little bit more. It was very, very, and as long as they're not freed through manumission, they're still owed by their legal authority, who is the person who they owe the debt to. So manumission is not likely. Great questions. I think the takeaway from all of it is Philemon owns Onesimus. He owns him. He owns all rights to him. There is, Rome doesn't care about Onesimus's rights. He has no rights. Philemon determines Onesimus's rights. Okay? Let's talk about this. Wrong one. How does gospel impact culture? We're getting into it a little bit. You guys are asking really good questions. Think, pair, turn to someone next to you, talk about this. Ready, go. I'm going to keep talking because sometimes people worry that if they're the first person to talk, someone's going to hear what they have to say. And so I'm going to be the white noise in the background while you turn to someone and talk and think about this. How do you think? Well, I think that culture, keep going, let's go. Well, how does culture impact gospel? Talk amongst yourselves. Come on. Dexter's already done it. Greg's already done it. Good, there you go. Traditions sometimes can be good things, right? Culture sometimes can be good things. So I had a very wise church history professor one time who may or may not be in the room right now, and he said this: traditions are the living faith of the dead. Traditions are the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. Yep, chew on that for a little bit. Traditions are the living faith of the dead. Man, I love some of the things that my grandparents gave to my parents who then gave it to me. They're full of life. And there are some things that Kristen and I are now doing that are saying, well, we don't want to parent like that, so what culture, what traditions are we building? One thing I want us to get clear on is some people think that they're not building culture. That's impossible. You are always building culture with the people you're around. You're just aware of it or not. It's better to be aware of the way you are building culture with the people that you're with. Your habits form you. There's a really great book by a guy named James K. Smith that I would recommend to anybody. It's called You Are What You Love. You are what you love. And he's going to be pulling from this really pretty smart guy named Augustine, who said, the things that you do kind of become the things that you love. The things that you love become kind of who you are. And so another way to say that is what are your cultural practices? What are your cultural liturgies? What your family does all the time is your family culture. And that culture is forming you and the people in your family. We can be really critical of paterfamilia, because, there's some things about it that were awful. But let's not pretend that we don't have a family culture in America. Let's not pretend that our family culture in America is sent from God and that it is the only right way. We are all, thank you, Miss Mary, making culture all the time. Are we aware of the culture we are making or not? This is going to be a central question to what Paul is writing to the Colossians. Paul has never known anything other than first century Roman culture. Our culture is unimaginable to him. We can't assume it goes without saying. We have to try to understand what his it goes without saying is. Okay? So we have got to try to understand what Paul's culture was, because Paul might say something, okay, here's what I really want to say. I really wish, we're not going to get to Philemon today, but I really wish, we'll get to it next week, I really want Paul to say to Philemon, and by the way, this whole slavery thing, Christians should have no part of it. You should free all your slaves, and you should lead your city into freeing all their slaves. And he doesn't. And I don't like that. I do think he is subtly, rhetorically, ninja kind of trying to convince and manipulate Philemon to free Onesimus. But here's what I want to say and why I need us to talk about culture. I don't think Paul could have comprehended a Roman culture where slavery is being abolished. So what we want to talk about is a trajectory of Paul's truth and goodness. It was absurd for Paul to suggest that he should free one slave. We want Paul to say all slavery is evil. But we've got to understand culture to be generous listeners of Paul, to understand that Paul couldn't have said that. There's no history of any empire ever not having slaves. Rome has become so dependent on slaves that they are the first slave society of the world, even putting Egypt to shame. So, how does culture impact gospel? How is Paul influencing Colossae? How is Colossae and the Roman Empire influencing Paul? And that is going to get into inspiration. And we're going to have to understand and ask ourselves, what do we mean when we say Colossae is the inspired word of God and Paul doesn't abolish slavery? We're all in agreement that Paul should have abolished slavery. Right? Okay, good. We all agree it should have been abolished. My personal opinion, if I'm trying to be generous to Paul, is that it would not have ever occurred to him. The reason I think Philemon unlocks Colossae is, while Paul doesn't do what I want him to do, is he actually doing something more radical, more subversive, more likely to change culture and transform culture for Christ than the thing I want him to do. I don't think if Paul told Philemon to abolish slavery in Colossae that it would have even worked. It's impractical. But what he does is ask Philemon to lead a countercultural revolution in his own family. And those of us who have families know changing your family is a lot more hard than theoretical culture change. Changing ourselves so that we might transform culture is the hardest thing. And that's what he's asking Philemon. And so when we think about culture and how it affects gospel, well, that's a question maybe for how every individual person would answer it. There's multiple levels of culture and gospel interaction. That's a great place to end. Okay, we didn't even get to a single word of the books that we were going to, so I'm sorry, but you know what? I'm not sorry, because this was a great conversation. I talked more today than I'm going to talk next week, so please come back. I hope it was as rich for you as it was for me, and I hope next week's as rich for you as it will be for me too. My prayer, this is going to be my prayer, and I'm going to have my eyes open, and I'm just going to say it. My prayer for this class is not that we would learn more. Go back to the beginning. It's not about formation, not information, but formation over information. My prayer is that we would learn and that God would bless our minds so that we would be intentional about the culture that we're building in our families and our lives, so that we would be Christians, Christ, that are transforming the micro and the meta cultures that we're a part of. So go in peace and be filled with Christ this week, because he that is in you is greater than that which is in the world. And you are bearers of hope to all the people that you do life with. So love you. Go in peace.